Welcome back to Storytime with Lavader. I was not actually planning on making another response video, but my Homo sapien brain only now started realizing that these things actually are doing more numbers than my regular videos. So I just decided, I guess I will be doing response videos more regularly now. But don't worry, I will get back to my regular videos. Eventually. So today we will be looking back towards another friend of ours, Balkan Odyssey, whom I made a video on a couple of months ago. So I would like to first congratulate him on being the first content creator I made 2 response videos on. You are my strongest punching bag. Now, I could hear you saying, Lav, don't you think you've had enough? Every response video you make seems to be about communists. And you are absolutely right. And I am fully committed to milking this cow dry until BreadTube disintegrates and they stop being cheeky little goobers. But I will say that I am gonna try my best to search for a non-communist victim, but I won't make any promises. So, what is our friend arguing today? Why commie blocks are amazing. Weird hill to die on, but sure, I will bite. This is an interesting topic, and I also had intended to talk about commie blocks at some point. Besides, he attacked my BFF living ironically in Europe, he is my queen, and God help anyone who dares disrespect my queen. So this is also personal. In preparation for this video, I had to acquire and skim through a few Soviet architecture and housing books, which were kinda boring, and some of these prices were outrageous. Welp, here is hoping for a return on investment, so let's just jump straight ahead and see what our friend is arguing.
The first step in understanding the nature of the notorious commie bloc is to take a look at how things were before they emerged, at the time before socialism itself. We need to equate ourselves with the material conditions in Eastern Europe before the Communist Revolution took the world by storm, and how people actually used to live like in the various monarchist and Tsarist regimes. By all accounts and metrics, pre-socialist Eastern Europe, including parts of Asia included in the Soviet Union, as well as the Balkans, were and pretty much always have been far behind all of Western Europe. And by far behind, I literally mean over 100 years behind the socioeconomic developments and conditions of developed Western countries. Nothing about their backwardness and maldevelopment was of their own making, however. As capitalism was ripening beyond its monopoly stage and beginning to transcend the national confines of countries such as the UK, France, and Germany by the year 1900, Eastern Europe and Asia were stuck in archaic conditions, with a semi-feudal, purely agrarian economy that had very little to no industrial output and was in many ways dependent on Western capital, which was ruthlessly expanding at their expense. This was of course done with the help of local comprador elites, which sold their souls and their nations to the whim of Western capital, in exchange for unchallenged local rule, as long as they behave and maintain the system that degrades and exploits their own people.
Okay, there is quite a bit to unpack here. Portraying the entirety of Eastern Europe as backward and feudal is something communists like Odyssey really love doing, but how much does it hold up? Of course, a lot of Eastern Europe was agrarian, I'm not disputing that fact, but there were still efforts being made to modernize and industrialize these areas with the aid of the more developed Western Europe through more open trade and investments. I will focus right now on Russia since it is the main country talked about in the video. It is an undisputed fact that under the reign of Nicholas II and his Prime Minister Sergei Witte, Russia was rapidly industrializing. Policies like the gold standard and state capitalism were implemented to aid in this development, with the Russian economy growing by a whopping 8% annually. Sean McMeekin details in his book just how rapid this industrialization and modernization was. Whatever with his formula, it seemed to work. By 1900, the economy was growing at 8% annually. Mining, metalworking, and energy all surged ahead. Such ports as Riga on the Baltic Sea and Odessa on the Black Sea nearly quintupled in size during the Witte years, while boomtowns sprang up everywhere from western Siberia to the Caspian Sea, where filthy, oil-saturated Baku was transformed almost overnight into one of the richest cities in the world, producing, among other fortunes, that of the noble family, which still pays for the prizes today. But what of the peasants and serfdom? Of course, Russia being such a massive and agrarian country, the nation couldn't switch to a commercialized form of agriculture at a snap of fingers. It was a gradual process, from serfdom being partially abolished by Alexander II, and then further efforts being made afterwards. The efforts of Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin best showed that. Under his tenure, he implemented important land reforms that freed peasants from obligations to local communes and the peasant land bank extending easy credit. Stolypin's efforts created millions of new landowners and commercialized agriculture. McMeekin would write on this. Creating millions of new landowners, Stolypin's agrarian reforms also expanded the acreage of cultivated land, along with agricultural productivity. By 1911, Russia had achieved an export surplus of 13.5 million tons of grain, a total exceeded in 1913 when an astonishing total of 20 million tons were shipped abroad. Grain exports, in turn, paid for the inputs and machinery needed in Russia's thriving factories. My question is, if what Odyssey says is true, that these leaders sold their souls and prevented the country from developing, why were they rapidly industrializing and making efforts to create millions of new peasant landowners in Russia? Sure, you could say that to an extent before the late 19th century that Russia was some feudal backwater, but then how do you explain these industrialization and land reform efforts? Because they can't. Communists depend on the narrative that Russia was a stagnant backwater because without it, they can't justify a lot of the things they say about the creation of the Soviet Union, as Odyssey is setting up here.
It shouldn't then be surprising that with such a geopolitical predicament, the laboring population of these countries was living in very archaic and primitive conditions. The vast majority of people were peasants, living in villages with little to no basic infrastructure and access to basic utilities. Cramped, transgenerational living spaces with shared outdoor toilets were the norm. The few that lived in the cities got to experience all the wonders of early capitalist industry and its cramped and inhumane working and living conditions, often accompanied with raging homelessness and pauperism. Housing solutions were insufficient, ineffective, and owned by a small minority of parasitic landlords. The October Revolution and subsequent civil war, necessitated and summoned by decades of Tsarist misery, exploitation, and poverty, combined with collective efforts of Western nations to drown the revolution in blood and destroy the Soviet Union through invasion and all imaginable forms of sabotage, only deepened the already dire situation.
Actually, Odyssey, funny that you mentioned that. You wanna know what really deepened the already dire situation? It wasn't the Western sanctions or infiltration efforts, that's for sure. No, it was the policies undertaken by the Soviet Union. You remember how I mentioned previously something about Russian peasants having some communal obligation? Well, peasants did not really own their own land, but the land was instead owned by the village community, an institution known as Mir. Under Mir, peasants could not leave the village without authorization from the community, and they still practiced an outdated crop rotation system known as a three-field system. Under Stolypin's land reforms in Tsarist Russia, the Mir institution was being completely wiped out. Peasants could now leave and actually own their own land instead of it being owned collectively by the community, and this caused a massive agricultural boom, as Alec Nove writes in his book An Economic History of the USSR. Similarly, there was a most impressive rise in the various forms of agricultural cooperation, showing that, with the breakup of the Mir, new and better ways of expanding peasant commercial activities were being devised. The membership of rural credit cooperatives rose from 181,000 in 1905 to 7 million in 1914. The number of rural consumer cooperatives rose in the same period from 348 to 8,877. Marketing cooperatives grew rapidly. One of these, which organized peasant butter producers in Siberia, maintained an agency in London and made great progress with exports. Thus, the last decade of Tsardom may have been the harbinger of an agricultural leap forward. Okay, now here comes the hilarious part. You wanna know what the Bolsheviks did after the Russian Revolution in the field of land reform? They brought back and empowered the Mir institution and stripped farmers of their private property. The years of revolution had undone much of the positive effects of the Stolypin reforms. The traditional peasant community had presided over most of the land redistribution in 1918. It now had more power than at any time since 1906 to redistribute peasant holdings, to insist on traditional strip cultivation. In 1925, over 90% of the peasants belonged to village communities. It could be asserted that 350,000 such communities controlled the economic life of the village. Thus, the effect of the revolution was, in a technical sense, reactionary. The three-field system was predominant, and modern crop rotation little used, as they did not fit the Mir arrangements. According to evidence cited by Lewin, even as late as 1928, 5.5 million households still used the socha, and half the grain harvest was reaped by cycle or scythe. 40% was threshed with flails. Such modernization as had begun earlier in the century was largely lost. So you are telling me that under Tsarist Russia, the communal Mir institution was abolished, creating millions of new independent peasant landowners, leading to more a boom in crop exports. Then the Soviets came in and re-empowered Mir, stripping peasants of their newly acquired private property and de facto brought back subsistence farming. And then they unironically claimed that Tsarist Russia was the reactionary backwater. And the collectivization under Stalin did not make things better. The Russian peasants were well on their way towards a prosperous future. And then it was the Bolsheviks who came in and undid everything the land reforms in Tsarist Russia aimed to achieve. Western sanctions my ass. You guys have no one to blame for this than yourself, and then you point the fingers at us.
The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 made an already intolerable housing situation even worse. The war caused widespread poverty destruction in the eastern part of the USSR. According to Soviet figures, 1,710 cities, towns, and urban settlements were fully or partially destroyed, as were many thousands of villages. More than 25 million people were left homeless. Leningrad, Kiev, Minsk, Smolensk, Stalingrad, and other cities and towns had to be almost completely rebuilt from heaps of broken brick and rubble. Solutions were needed quickly. What these Eastern Bloc countries didn't have compared to Western Europe was the privilege of American loans, aid, and capital. Those divine spoils that managed to reset German industry in no time and realigned all Western European productive forces with American capital interests, concretely manifesting itself in the form of the European Union. The Eastern Socialist Bloc was not only excluded from the famous Marshall Plan, but was actively cut off and excluded from all European economical and political currents.
Give me a second, I need to do something. Alright, let's see. June 5th, 1947, Marshall Plan. This was a program of economic aid offered by the United States to any European country. The plan was rejected outright by Stalin, and any Eastern Bloc country considering accepting aid was reprimanded severely. Consequently, the aid was only given to Western European countries. I mean, he didn't even try here. All I did was make a 5-second Google search, didn't even have to open a book.
So, considering this context, the Soviet-era urbanization projects, which occurred in several phases from the 30s to the 1980s, were fascinating to say the very least. These ambitious undertakings transformed ravaged post-war ruins into thriving metropolises, which managed to house pretty much everyone, with virtually zero homelessness to be seen in any former socialist state. The Soviet Union undertook one of the most massive centrally controlled and planned policies for human and industrial resettlement in history. Since 1926, the Soviet government had built more than 1,400 new towns, in which more than 50 million people live, work, and play. During the first 5-year plans, it reached the highest urban concentration rate ever recorded before World War II in any major country. By 1977, the Soviet Constitution officially guaranteed its citizens the right to housing through Article 44.
You wanna know why the Soviet Union had virtually zero homelessness? It wasn't because it had somehow single-handedly eradicated it, but because being homeless was literally a crime. During the 5-year plan under Stalin, millions flooded into the cities from the countryside looking for work, and with an already bad housing crisis, this influx made it a colossal problem. But since it was illegal to be a beggar on the street, what was the state's solution? Jam entire families into crowded communal apartments. Odyssey gives the impression that everyone had received an apartment, privacy, a bathroom, but no, homelessness was quote-unquote eradicated by pushing everyone into communal living spaces in absolute horrid conditions. Sheila Fitzpatrick mentions this in her book Everyday Stalinism. During the first 5-year plan period alone, more than 10 million peasants moved to towns and became wage earners. The massive migration produced a housing crisis of mammoth proportions. Like other kinds of scarcity, this one turned out to be a permanent feature of Soviet life, with families jammed for decades in tiny single rooms in communal apartments with shared kitchens and, if such existed, bathrooms. Stalin and the Soviet government were more concerned with grand projects than with ordinary house building or the maintenance and repair of existing houses. We even have statistics of how Soviet citizens lived in Moscow. 6% had more than one room, 40% lived in one room, 23.6% occupied only a part of a room, 5% lived in kitchens and corridors, and 25% lived in dormitories. But of course, you could say this was under Stalin. Balkan Odyssey clearly is referring to the Cold War era where these ambitious housing efforts were undertaken. I mean, yeah, things improved. In a way, the majority of urban families now lived in separate dwellings, a gold medal for that, but for comparison, the average living space per person in 1950 was only 5 square meters per person. And now look what Henry W. Morton says in his book, The Contemporary Soviet City. 30 years later, a majority of urban families lived in separate dwellings, and the average space per person had increased to 8.7 square meters. Some cities provided much better housing accommodations in terms of space than others. Differences ranged from Moscow's 11.2 square meters to Dushanbe's 6.6 square meters per person. However, the promise made in the 1962 party program that each family would have a separate apartment by 1980 has not been kept. Approximately 20% of the urban population still lived communally, and an additional 5% are sheltered in workers' dormitories. They are the housing poor of the USSR. The only places where conditions improved were the main big cities like Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad, and if you were outside of these major cities, you would be lucky if you even got 1 or 2 extra square meters of space. For plenty of regions, there was little, if any, improvement in this area since the Stalin period. So that's why the Soviets had quote-unquote virtually zero homelessness. They criminalized it and pushed anyone they could find in cramped small communal living spaces, which led to very poor living conditions. But of course, Odyssey conveniently leaves all of this out.
So, how did they actually do it then? Well, the basis of those accomplishments is their political approach towards housing. Instead of focusing on maximizing landlord revenue and squeezing out as much rent out of tenants regardless of the consequences, socialist countries insisted on more humanist principles, like, providing everyone with a roof over their head, no questions asked. Despite many issues, drawbacks, and humanist challenges facing any industrializing society, compared to the state of affairs in the initial industrial revolution in the Western world, the Soviet approach turns out to be a lot more humane. Despite obvious corruption and bureaucratic abuses due to still existing social stratification, they nonetheless focused on assuring equal opportunities for housing, equalizing the standard of living of different social groups, creating the working class basis for provincial cities, etc.
Equal opportunities for housing and an equalized standard of living. Yeah, I am not too sure about that. It has been very extensively documented that those involved with the party, like bureaucrats and intellectuals, actually received dibs on better and more spatial housing. High-ranking party officials often obtained luxurious mansions, sometimes built with state funds or resources diverted from other budgets. For example, from the archives of Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, many people wrote to him appealing for goods and housing. The Russian writer Pavel Lilin, for example, received a one-room apartment of 18 square meters all for himself from him. And another writer, Alexei Tolstoy, received an 8 to 10 room mansion all for himself. And this was an issue that still continued during the Cold War. This wasn't a case of corruption and some backroom deals, it was the norm. It was public policy. Certain occupational groups received different kinds of housing. The book Cities After Socialism elaborates on this. The allocation of occupational groups among different kinds of housing revealed a striking distinction between relatively higher proportions of bureaucrats, intellectuals, technicians, and clerical workers in first-class state housing and lower proportions of skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled workers. The same distinction was shown for those with their own banked finance or cooperative apartment. However, in private housing, usually of poor quality, the situation was reversed. So, in general, the higher status groups received better housing with the highest state subsidies. Ivan Szelenyi wrote an entire book on urban inequality and state socialism, and he affirmed the exact same thing, that this was public policy, not some form of corruption. The social groups with the highest incomes moved steadily towards the highest housing classes in the state and market sectors, and came close to monopolizing them. Below that, the highest class of housing available to most of those with lower incomes is the second market class, i.e. the range of family houses omitting the superior villa category. The housing options and opportunities of these lower classes are limited more by state policies which allocate state housing and credit than by the people's capacity to pay. Public policy thus provides that, on average, the richer classes get better housing for less money and effort, while the poorer classes get worse housing at the cost of more money or effort, or both. Doesn't this literally go against the principles of equality that communism upholds? If people with higher paying jobs and party members receive more luxurious housing all for themselves, while the working class has to live in the slums in communal apartments, then how is that different from the capitalists they are supposedly fighting against?
So, how exactly did they solve the insane housing shortage? Well, for one, mass-owned housing units of the local bourgeoisie and aristocracy were expropriated and redistributed to those in need. The leeches and parasites of society had lost their massive properties, so that everyone who actually works gets a roof over their head as quickly as possible.
Actually, a little fun fact about those expropriated buildings by the aristocracy, or really any building that was built under the horrible system of capitalism. All of those buildings were completely neglected, and some of them were even torn down because they were supposedly a reminder of capitalist living conditions, and so they wanted to show how superior socialism was. So a lot of these places became completely uninhabitable later on and served as dumping grounds for those deemed undesirable by the Communist Party. This was particularly the case for other Eastern European countries, especially Eastern Germany, quoting cities after socialism again. Thus, the pre-1945 city was largely neglected. There were several reasons for this. First, quarters which still contained old tenement houses were a reminder of capitalist living conditions, which were supposed to have been overcome by socialism. Therefore, in the large cities, there began the removal of the old buildings. In the new residential areas, the power of socialism could be self-evidently demonstrated. The pre-war buildings remained with amenity levels at early 20th century standards, and through decay, more and more of them became uninhabitable. After 1970, some dwellings were renovated, but their numbers were marginal. These old buildings had also been used as dumping grounds for those social groups which were not highly valued by the ruling party: nonconformists, dissidents, troublemakers, elderly people, and unskilled workers in the less important branches of industry. This is one indication that some social segregation did in fact occur, and yet the assimilation of the classes was a top priority, a constantly emphasized goal in the GDR social policy. So, instead of actually fixing up these old buildings seized from the aristocrats and capitalists, they just completely neglected them and left them to rot, sending all the dissidents there to live like squatters, all to show how superior socialism was, instead of actually using their resources to make these places livable.
On the other hand, the entire process of creating housing units was standardized and industrialized, fueled by innovative architectural and urban planning solutions, which solved issues of efficiency, price, and speed. Thus began the industrial production of standardized, prefabricated concrete panels on a massive scale, which could be shipped and assembled very quickly without the need for skilled labor, despite delays and abuses in bureaucratic decision-making. And so, the infamous Khrushchevka, Brezhnevka, and all other subsequent variants were born. Quality was to be sacrificed for quantity. Khrushchev asked, "Do you build 1,000 adequate apartments or 700 good ones? And would a citizen rather settle for an adequate apartment or wait 10 to 15 years for a very good one?" The leadership must proceed from the principle of using available material resources to satisfy the needs of the people as soon as possible. So, as bland as these blocks may seem to us from a modern Western perspective, they were a testament to hitherto unseen sociological progress, led by a doctrine of scientific functionalism. The approach included 4 general but basic elements characteristic of socialist urban planning, namely standardization, proper size of a town, the city's center, and the neighborhood unit concept, all of them more closely explained in this paper.
Here is the main problem with commie blocks. It's not that they were cheaply built, it's that they were too cheaply built. As Odyssey said in the video, the Soviets preferred quantity over quality and emphasized speed and standardization. While they did manage to crank out a lot of these buildings very fast, the cost of them in the long run was absolutely not worth it. Many corners were cut in the process of their production, leading to low quality construction and inadequate infrastructure and service provision, meaning that the average commie block had a lifespan of 10 to 20 years. And the worst part of it all was the maintenance costs. They were plagued by poor maintenance, but also a lack of it. Turns out that if you crank out very cheap buildings, things are gonna decay faster and get broken more. Meaning that in the long run, you spend more on maintaining these buildings than building them. And with how much demand there was for maintenance, the Soviet government could not afford it at all. And it led to these buildings rapidly decaying and turning into the textbook definition of slums. The quality of the existing housing stock deteriorated, leading to a physical and even the social decay of established neighborhoods. Furthermore, almost all new buildings were concentrated in large new developments, typically at a significant distance from the decaying city centers. The nationalization of existing urban housing has led, without exception, in all socialist countries to a neglect of the stock. Housing authorities were under tremendous pressure to keep rents low in order to match the low wages and to build as much new housing as possible. This policy, with low rent revenues and pressure to use funds for new construction, meant that the existing housing stock was not adequately maintained, and by the late 1960s, it began to deteriorate seriously. Hillel Tickton, a South African Marxist theorist and economist who studied and lived in the Soviet Union, also had to point this out as a critique of the Soviet housing policy. The same problem that may appear as one of many difficulties in capitalism is a crucial moment in the Soviet system. The production of poor quality housing under capitalism is a fact of life that may increase the profits of the construction companies. In the USSR, it leads to enormous costs of repair, problems of replacement, and to an absorption of resources that the system cannot afford. At all times, the poor quality of the Soviet product constitutes a contradiction of the system. This wasn't the case of quote-unquote adequate housing as Khruschev and Balkan Odyssey imply. These buildings were not adequate at all, not only for the government but the people living there too. They were so cheaply built, so many corners cut, that these places were decaying and deteriorating fast and required round-the-hour maintenance that in the 10 to 20 years of their lifespan would cost more than building the thing. And surprise, surprise, the state did not have the funds for a lot of this maintenance, so they decayed more rapidly at the detriment of the people living there. But I can hear you saying, these were, again, temporary solutions until the state could get back on its feet and provide something better. It's better than being out on the streets, and alright, this is a point I am willing to concede some points on. I actually wouldn't have a problem with this section if Odyssey referred to them as inadequate temporary living spaces that were better than nothing, but this is how he refers to them.
So, as bland as these blocks may seem to us from a modern Western perspective, they were a testament to hitherto unseen sociological progress, led by a doctrine of scientific functionalism. All socialist countries ended up providing both very affordable housing and a very high rate of home ownership to millions of people. Both of these concepts are pretty much inconceivable to the modern working class person, whose place of residence isn't placed quote-unquote in the service of man, but in the service of landlords and capital.
He makes it seem like these were, again, average but not luxurious spaces and quote-unquote unseen and unfathomable sociological progress. I have no idea how living in a decaying, run-down slum of a building while having to share it with strangers is this insane sociological progress, but okay, I guess, if you want to compare it on Soviet metrics, but that is barely, if at all, a bar for many of these evil capitalist countries back in the West to pass.
Besides a few suboptimal examples, they encouraged communal housing and coexistence, and bonded local communities in a way completely alien to modern capitalist housing solutions. The proposed collective way of life, with its concentration of state-owned public services, led architects to invent a dom comuna, or house commune, which was practically a dormitory for workers. A house commune was to be equipped with all the facilities for living, including cultural and sports facilities.
Yeah, are you really sure about that? Commie blogs are probably one of the worst examples to use if you want to argue that they fostered a sense of community distinct from capitalist solutions. From all of the sources I read about these communal apartments and houses, they all paint a completely bleak picture of life in these spaces. There really was no harmonious coexistence. If anything, it created more tensions between the people living there. Sheila Fitzpatrick would write, "In reality, by most accounts, communal apartments were far from encouraging of communal attitudes and practices among residents. In fact, they tended to do the opposite. Private property, including the pots, pans, and plates that had to be stored in the kitchen, a public area, was jealously guarded by each individual family. Demarcation lines were strictly laid down. Envy flourished, where space and family size were often mismatched, and families with large rooms were often deeply resented by families with small ones. Out of these resentments came many denunciations and lawsuits whose objective was to increase the denouncers or plaintiff's living space at the expense of a neighbor. People had almost no privacy at all, and it didn't help the fact that there was little to no soundproofing, so everyone in the area could hear anything you talked about with another person. Divorced couples oftentimes had to still live in the same apartment or living space, which frequently led to the domestic abuse. Sometimes people would even falsely report other people to get them arrested so they can take over their space, and in extreme cases, it even went as far as murder. People killed their own family members, like their aunts or uncles, to gain possession of their part of the apartment or house. In fact, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, with housing starting to get privatized, these communal spaces were eyed as luxury apartments, and current sitting tenants, mainly elderly people, were commonly murdered for the property. Kiril Stanilov writes on this in his book, The Post-Socialist City. Sitting tenants represented a key obstacle for such conversions as the conflict of interest heated up in the 1990s, leading to increased pressure on the residents to relocate. In some cases, this pressure escalated to criminal acts and even murder. Elderly people who had intended to increase their pension by selling their housing rights at the price of life annuity were left with a strikingly short remaining lifetime. Between 1993 and 1996, the media reported on a multitude of criminal acts connected to housing purchases, including gruesome stories circulated in the neighborhoods. Thus, a frightened population perceived housing privatization increasingly as a source of incalculable risks. Yeah, such a wonderful sense of community you managed to foster there with these things. At least Khruschev and Brezhnev realized this and focused on single-family apartments and getting people out of the communes, but Odyssey is just glazing these communal spaces, which I find quite funny.
The broader city blocks were essentially self-sufficient subregions that were centrally planned to have everything one could ever need on a daily basis nearby, accessible, and in walkable distance. Assembled buildings were fitted into a designed housing district that the Soviets called a microborough. The microborough consists of residential superblocks and was conceived as a self-sufficient unit containing the essential social and cultural services for as many as several 100,000 people. Microboroughs were to be located on the peripheries of city cores, to which they would be tied by transportation arteries, and to which they would look for the major administrative, commercial, and cultural services. These connections were often achieved with reliable and cheap public transport, often on a very massive scale. Take Moscow's incredible metro system as a prime example of this.
Okay, let's address these things one by one since there is a bit to go through. So let's start with probably the biggest one, that they provided equal access to provisions for everyone and that they were self-sufficient communities. First of all, microboroughs were not designed to house several 100,000 people. They were actually designed for a range of 5,000 to 15,000 residents. But that's just a small nitpick. In fact, the idea behind them is amazing. People having their day-to-day needs met in their locality instead of having to travel to the other side of the city, and within a few minutes of walking is a genius design idea. Emphasis on that idea part. One thing you will notice in this segment is the fact that the Odyssey is saying and quoting other people who describe the theory of how they should work, not how they actually worked. The microboroughs were in fact designed this way, but the biggest problem with them was the same thing that plagued housing: inequality. Some microboroughs were reserved specifically for certain upper social groups, and these received better maintenance, more provisions, and more spatial housing, while others lacked a lot of these things. This is why some microboroughs look like this, and others like... The reality was, of course, somewhat different. For example, the socialist city was more completely achieved in new towns than in those which had inherited urban legacy. Large facilities could not be distributed in urban space equitably, and there was differentiation in the quality of housing and in access by various social groups to it. Housing in particular was a part of the reward structure for elites and other favored groups, and there were distinct areas of the city which had higher status occupants, better housing, less crime and deviance, and so on. In fact, these poorer and more neglected microboroughs never received a few of these guaranteed services that other microboroughs had access to, quoting Stanilov on this. In theory, each component part of the housing estate was to be provided with services calculated on the basis of its size and placed in the established hierarchy. In order to assure equality of living standards, specific norms were developed to determine the type and size of the required services, including schools, playgrounds, libraries, hospitals, etc. In reality, however, only a few of the planned facilities and services were provided, and the housing estates functioned as enormous dormitories at the urban periphery, with virtually no supply of jobs and a limited level of services. Again, this wouldn't be an issue in usual cases since, inequality is natural and bound to exist. But this directly goes against everything the Soviet Union stood for supposedly, and what Odyssey is advocating here. He is saying and making the point that inequality did not exist. Everyone received the same access to these things and so forth, when no certain groups and professions in the USSR were treated better and received better housing and goods than others, mainly the intelligentsia and bureaucracy. And this goes against the whole equality aspect of the Soviet Union and communism, an ideology revolving around the working class where the working class isn't even entitled to the best of services. And this is exactly why Odyssey is only saying what the intention and plan of these microboroughs was, not how they were actually implemented in reality. Wouldn't be the first time they prioritized theory over praxis.
Taken in their totality, though, these buildings were actually very robust, weather-resistant, with very good longevity, especially compared to the irresponsibly cheap, half-assed buildings where modern construction companies cut corners by saving on materials and ignoring safety regulations, for the sole purpose of turning a profit. But why do commie blocks look like shit and are rotting like a bag of potatoes nowadays then? Well, that's what 30 years of neglect looks like. The new capitalist establishment that inherited them simply has no interest in maintaining or refurbishing the housing units because it's just simply more profitable to build 10 fancy modernist apartment buildings that barely anyone can afford. They therefore let them crumble under the weight of time, giving them this distinctly depressing and dystopian look. This gives them yet another excuse to slander socialism for dystopianism, which they encourage with their own neglect.
I just love how absolutely slimy this is. He is blaming the rotting and decaying of these buildings on capitalism rather than the communists who built them with these cheap things in the first place. I have already addressed the fact that they were neglected during Soviet times, but saying that after socialism these buildings were completely neglected is also absolutely false. Many former socialist countries had already initiated programs for renovation and revitalization of these buildings. For example, Germany embarked on a huge process of revitalizing these commie blocks in East Berlin. In the span of 10 years, in 2002, 60% of the dwellings had been completely renovated and 25% partially renovated. On the internet, you can find hundreds of photos of newly renovated commie blocks from the Eastern Bloc that look absolutely stunning today. It is amazing how much difference they make. But here is the issue. Due to the way they are built, that is, so cheaply, and due to the decay and lack of maintenance during the socialist eras, these commie blocks were very, very expensive to renovate and bring standards up to date. You wanna know how much Germany spent per dwelling in a commie block during the renovations? Close to 29,000 euros in today's money. 29,000 per dwelling. That is how poorly maintained and feeble these structures were. Germany most definitely spent hundreds of millions, if not a billion euros, renovating these places in East Berlin. It would quite literally be cheaper to bulldoze them and just build new buildings. And considering that many Eastern Bloc countries don't have the finances Germany has, it kinda makes sense why some of them are left to their own devices, with only a minimal number of them getting the renovation they need. It is sad, and I would wish that more could be done for these buildings, but that's just the reality. It is not that the capitalists aren't maintaining them because they are, I don't know, evil or something. It's just that it's not worth it. You'd be better off tearing them down or building new ones somewhere else than trying to completely renovate existing buildings. But at the end of the day, I can still hear a lot of you saying, sure, commie blocks had all of these problems and they were not exactly of average quality, but at least, at the very least, they were better than people sleeping outside and had some kind of roof over their head, even if it was a decaying one. And you know what? I actually completely agree on this. I understand the kind of impact World War II had on housing, millions being left completely homeless and many city areas devastated beyond repair. Desperate measures were indeed needed. Khruschev tried his best to alleviate this issue, even if it meant sacrificing quality for quantity. People needed roofs over their heads, and if that meant cutting corners in construction, using cheap material, and neglecting the buildings to some extent, then so be it. Those are things I completely recognize and sympathize with. What I was specifically pushing back on in regards to Odyssey's video were his claims that these commie blocks were adequate to good, when that was completely not the case. Odyssey could have taken a different approach. Instead of arguing that they were awesome, he could have shed more light and context as to why commie blocks were needed in the first place, and that while in a lot of cases were not good in terms of quality and living standard, they at least provided people with a roof over their heads, and could have served as temporary residences until better solutions were found. He could have again made them more sympathetic than completely glazing them. I would have had absolutely no problem with that reasoning, but that is not the approach he took. Commie blocks were indeed necessary at that time, but they were far from anything considered awesome. But let us not forget another crucial thing. The Germans weren't the catalyst for the housing crisis. All they did was make an already bad situation even worse. So let's take a small step back. I think a lot of this responsibility should be placed on Stalin and his government. When he took power, I have no doubt that there was a housing crisis, but he most definitely made it worse. Due to his collectivization efforts, millions of people from rural areas flocked to the cities, and these areas were not ready to handle this many people, and housing was virtually neglected by Stalin. For the majority of the population, the housing situation was no better. Under Stalin, housing was the chronically underfunded stepchild that received whatever resources were left after priority items had been taken care of. For years, the housing shortage grew continually worse, and then came the devastation of war. As of the beginning of 1953, there was an average of 4.5 square meters of residential housing per urban resident. It is necessary to mention also that availability of housing space in urban areas continued to decline. Stalin seemed more concerned with prestige projects such as the lavishly decorated Moscow Underground Railway than with ordinary house building or the maintenance and repair of the existing houses. Conditions in big cities became very difficult, and Moscow was among the worst. Despite the extraordinary growth in the Soviet urban population in the 1930s, residential housing construction was almost as neglected as the manufacture of consumer goods. It was not until the Khruschev period that anything was done to alleviate the tremendous overcrowding that had characterized Soviet urban life for over a quarter of a century. Meanwhile, people lived in communal apartments, usually one family to a room, and in dormitories and barracks. A small, highly privileged group had separate apartments. Because, as it turns out, enacting policies that forced millions of people into the cities, already suffering under a horrible housing crisis, and concentrating them all in this one field, i.e. the city, is an astronomical disaster just waiting to happen. And all the Germans did was burst the bubble that had been inflating, and was on the verge of bursting.
Patrick!
Yeah, SpongeBob?
I don't think this bubble can get much bigger.
Nonsense!
Maybe if Stalinist Russia reconsidered some of its priorities, like actually constructing more housing, perhaps the post-war housing crisis may not have been that bad, or at least mitigated to some extent. And maybe even we could have seen some better alternatives and solutions popping up. But alas, that is not what happened. And in the end, all Khrushchev did was try to fix the mess left behind for him by Stalin. And for that, I kinda feel bad for the guy. But the point still stands, the housing crisis was not caused by capitalist subversion or something similar. It was Stalin's neglect and priorities that turned a normal-sized problem to a mammoth-sized problem. So really, tankies have no one really to blame other than their big sugar daddy. Anyway, that has been all for today, and I will see you all another time. Until then, stay safe and a happy new year.